I think I might hold the world record for the fastest a lawsuit has ever been thrown out of court. I'm not talking about a summary judgment that takes weeks of filings. I'm talking about a case that was alive 1 second and dead the next, dismissed with prejudice just 3 minutes after the proceedings began. The HOA that sued me spent over $20,000 on their lawyer just for him to stand there, turn the color of chalk, and watch his entire case disintegrate into dust and potential criminal charges. How did I manage to do it? Well, it helps when you're a lawyer and the person suing you has built their entire kingdom on a foundation of lies, forgeries, and pure, unadulterated audacity. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from, because you're not going to believe the level of suburban warfare I had to endure just to live in my own home peacefully. It all started when my wife and I bought what we thought was our dream house. For years, we'd been living in a cramped downtown condo, saving every penny. I just made partner at my law firm, specializing in corporate governance, which is a fancy way of saying I spend my days untangling the messes created by incompetent or corrupt executives. It's a job that requires a forensic level of attention to detail and a very low tolerance for nonsense, two traits that would soon become my primary weapons. Our new house was in a recently developed area on the edge of town. It was perfect. 4 bedrooms, a big yard for the dog we planned to get, and mature oak trees lining the back of the property. But the single most beautiful feature, the one that made me sign the papers with a flourish, was a simple declaration in the title documents. This property is not subject to any homeowners association covenants or restrictions. To me, those were the most poetic words in the English language. The subdivision was built in 2 distinct phases. Phase 1, called Crestwood Meadows, was a sprawling community of about 200 homes, complete with a community pool, tennis courts, and the iron-fisted HOA that managed them. Phase 2, where our house was located, was an additional 30 lots carved out of an adjacent parcel of land by the same developer a year later. It was marketed as the Enclave at Crestwood, a name designed to borrow the prestige of the original development without being shackled to its rules. The dividing line was clear on every single plat map filed with the county, a small, babbling creek and a line of ancient-looking stone markers. Crestwood Meadows was on the east side of the creek. The Enclave was on the west. We were on the west. It was unambiguous. It was legally recorded. It was, I thought, settled history. We moved in on a Saturday. The sun was shining, our friends were helping, and the feeling of unlocking our own front door for the first time was euphoric. We were so caught up in the chaos of unpacking that we didn't notice the sleek white Range Rover that had parked across the street. Nor did we notice the woman who got out and stood there, arms crossed, for a good 10 minutes, just watching us. Her face was a mask of pinched disapproval, her blonde hair pulled back into a ponytail so tight it seemed to be stretching the skin around her eyes. She was dressed in what I can only describe as aggressively leisurely attire. Pristine white tennis skirt, a pastel pink polo shirt, and shoes so white they hurt the eyes. Eventually, she marched across the street, her movements sharp and purposeful, and stopped at the end of our driveway. I was wrestling a particularly awkward box labeled kitchen, fragile, sort of, out of the back of a U-Haul. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying a tone that suggested I was already a disappointment. I set the box down, wiping sweat from my brow. "Hi there," I said, offering a friendly smile. "We're the new owners. I'm Mark." She did not return the smile. "I'm Brenda," she announced, as if I should already know the name. "I'm the president of the Crestwood Meadows Homeowners Association," she said, president, with the same gravity a person might use for a head of state. She then thrust a thick, professionally bound folder into my hands. "This is your welcome packet. It contains a copy of the community bylaws, the architectural modification request form, and your dues schedule. I've also included an initial invoice for your first month's dues, prorated, plus the move-in fee." I blinked, looking from the folder to her stern face. "Oh, I think there's been a misunderstanding," I said politely. "We're not in the HOA. Our property is in the Enclave, the second phase." Brenda let out a short, sharp laugh that contained no humor whatsoever. That's a common misconception among new residents who don't read their paperwork thoroughly. The Enclave is just a marketing name. All of this, she said, making a sweeping gesture that seemed to encompass the entire planet, is Crestwood Meadows. You're on the west side of the main boulevard. You're part of the association. Everyone knows that. With all due respect, Brenda, I said, my lawyer, brain automatically switching on, I've read my paperwork very thoroughly. The deed, the title report, the county plat map, they all explicitly state this lot is not part of the HOA. The boundary is the creek. She waved a dismissive hand, a large diamond on her finger catching the sun. Clerical errors. The developer's lawyers were notoriously sloppy. We're having it all corrected. In the meantime, you're a member. And speaking of which, she said, her eyes narrowing as she looked past me at the U-Haul, you've already got your first violation. Commercial vehicles are not permitted to be parked on the street for more than 2 hours. It's been 3. I'll have to write you a citation. It's a $50 fine. I'll waive it this one time as a courtesy, but don't let it happen again. I was dumbfounded. The sheer unmitigated gall was breathtaking. She was trying to fine me for moving into my own house. Brenda, I said, my voice losing its friendly edge, I'm not in your HOA. You have no authority here. You cannot levy fines against me. This property is not within your jurisdiction. Her lips tightened into a thin, bloodless line. You'll find that it is, she said, her voice dripping with condescension. You lawyers always think you're so smart, finding little loopholes. But we have our own lawyers, and they are very, very good. You'll receive a demand letter shortly. In the meantime, I expect that first dues payment by the end of the month. Welcome to the neighborhood. She turned on her heel and marched back to her Range Rover, leaving me standing in my driveway holding a useless folder and feeling a sensation I hadn't felt in a long time. A combination of profound disbelief and a gathering storm of righteous anger. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a declaration of war. She wasn't trying to correct a clerical error. She was trying to annex my property into her personal fiefdom. As she drove away, I looked at the welcome packet. On the front, in elegant gold lettering, it said, Crestwood Meadows HOA, preserving property values and community harmony. I had a feeling Brenda was doing neither. I went inside, placed the folder on the counter, and told my wife, I think I've just met the queen of the suburbs, and I think she wants to go to war. My wife, who knows me well, just sighed and said, well, she's picked a fight with the wrong person. Little did Brenda know, she hadn't just picked a fight. She had just handed a litigator a case file, pro bono, and I was about to begin my discovery phase. The first letters started arriving within a week. They were official looking, printed on expensive letterhead bearing the Crestwood Meadows HOA logo, and signed by Brenda in a florid, self-important script. The first was a formal demand for the prorated dues and the move-in fee, now listed as past due, with a late penalty tacked on. The second was a formal warning citation for the moving truck, stating that my one-time courtesy waiver was contingent on immediate payment of my dues. It was a masterclass in bureaucratic intimidation, designed to make an ordinary person feel overwhelmed and just pay to make the problem go away. But I wasn't an ordinary person in this context. I read legal threats for a living. These were hollow. They cited bylaws that didn't apply to me and threatened actions they had no legal standing to take. I filed them neatly in a new folder I labeled Suburban Warfare. My first step was simple due diligence. I didn't rely on the documents from my closing. I went straight to the source. I spent an afternoon at the county recorder's office, pulling the original, filed and stamped plat maps for both Crestwood Meadows Phase 1 and the Enclave at Crestwood Phase 2. The clerk, a wonderfully helpful woman named Doris who had seen it all, immediately understood what I was doing. Oh, trouble, she asked with a knowing sigh. I just nodded. The maps were crystal clear, even more so than the copies. A thick, bold line delineated the two developments, with our section, Phase 2, clearly labeled not subject to HOA covenants of Phase 1. I paid for certified copies of everything. This was my foundational evidence. the bedrock of my entire position. Next, I went online to the Secretary of State's website and pulled the complete corporate filings for the Crestwood Meadows Homeowners Association, Inc. I wanted to see their articles of incorporation, their registered agent, and their list of officers. Unsurprisingly, Brenda was listed as president, her husband, a meek-looking accountant named Gary, as treasurer, and two other names I didn't recognize as board members. I then drove to the address listed for their registered agent. It wasn't a law office, as it should have been. It was a UPS store. Brenda had listed a mailbox as her corporation's legal point of contact, a minor but telling violation of state corporate law, which requires a physical address where a person can be served. It was sloppy, and it was a clue. It told me that Brenda likely handled everything herself, with little to no professional oversight. The threats continued to escalate. A week later, a letter from an actual law firm arrived. It was a standard boilerplate demand letter. It stated that I was a member of the HOA in good standing, save for my delinquent account, which now totaled several $100s in dues and accumulated fines for things I couldn't even fathom. Apparently, my grass was half an inch too long. The color of my front door, the one installed by the builder, was an unapproved shade of burgundy. My recycling bin had been visible from the street for a full 3 hours on trash day. The list was as long as it was absurd. The lawyer, a man I'll call Mr. SUED, was clearly operating on information fed to him by Brenda. He likely hadn't spent 10 minutes looking at a plat map. He was just cashing a retainer and sending out form letters. I drafted a polite, professional response. I attached the certified copies of the county plat maps and the relevant sections of my deed. I explained, in simple, unambiguous legal terms, that his client had no jurisdiction over my property and that any further attempts to fine, harass, or contact me would be met with a lawsuit for harassment and damages. I sent it via certified mail. Return receipt requested. This, I thought, would be the end of it. No sane lawyer, when presented with irrefutable, government-certified evidence that his client's case is non-existent, would proceed. He would call his client, explain that she had made a grave error, and advise her to drop the matter immediately. Mr. SUED, however, was apparently not a sane lawyer. Or perhaps Brenda's powers of persuasion or the size of her retainer were simply too great. His response arrived a week later. It was dismissive, arrogant, and utterly shocking. My client, he wrote, disputes the validity of your so-called evidence. We are in possession of a superseding document, a legally executed amendment to the covenants, which annexes the Phase 2 properties into the Crestwood Meadows Homeowners Association. A copy is attached for your review. My client has instructed me to inform you that if your full delinquent balance is not paid within 10 business days, she will have no choice but to place a lien on your property. My blood ran cold for a second. An amendment? Could it be possible? Did the developer sneak something into the fine print? I ripped open the envelope containing the attachment. It was a 2-page document titled Third Amendment to the Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions for Crestwood Meadows. It looked vaguely official. It had signature lines, a notary block, and legal jargon. It claimed that on a date 6 months prior to my purchase, the declarant, the developer, and the HOA had mutually agreed to merge the two phases under the single HOA's governance. If this was real, I was in serious trouble. My entire case rested on those plat maps, and a subsequent, properly filed amendment could indeed supersede them. But then I started to actually read it. My training in corporate governance, in spotting fraudulent documents and procedural shortcuts, kicked in. The red flags started popping up, one after another. First, the developer's signature was just a generic, unidentifiable scrawl over a typed name of a company that had been formally dissolved 2 years ago, a fact I quickly verified. A dissolved company cannot execute legal documents. Second, the notary stamp was from a state halfway across the country, and the name was smudged. A quick search of that state's notary database revealed no such person. Third, and this was the kicker, the document referenced specific paragraphs from the original HOA covenants. but it got the numbers wrong. It was like a student trying to quote a book they'd only skimmed. But the most damning piece of evidence was the date. It was dated over a year after the county had officially signed off on the Phase 2 plat map that explicitly declared it HOA-free. For this amendment to be valid, it would have had to be filed with the county recorder's office. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a legal requirement. I spent the next hour online, cross-referencing everything. I called a contact I had at the title insurance company that had handled my closing. I asked him to do a deep dive, to check for any amendments, any liens, any recorded documents whatsoever that linked my lot to the Crestwood Meadows HOA. He called me back 2 hours later. "Mark," he said, "you're completely clean. There is nothing. I pulled the entire history back to the original land grant in the 1800s, just for fun. That lot has never, ever been encumbered by that HOA. The document you're describing, it doesn't exist in any official legal capacity. If they're showing it to you, it's a ghost. Or worse." Worse. He was right. This wasn't just an empty threat. This was fraud. This was a forged legal instrument. Brenda hadn't just overstepped her authority. She had crossed a bright, shining line into criminal behavior. She and her pet lawyer weren't just harassing me. They were attempting to extort money from me using a fabricated document. The game had changed. My initial plan to simply defend myself was no longer sufficient. This woman was a predator, using the shield of an HOA to run her own personal racket. Now, it was time to go on the attack. I wasn't just going to prove I wasn't in her HOA. I was going to find out exactly what was going on inside Crestwood Meadows. And I had a sneaking suspicion that this fraudulent amendment was just the tip of a very ugly iceberg. I scanned a copy of the forgery, saved it to a file marked Exhibit A, and began drafting a much different kind of letter. With the forged amendment in hand, my strategy shifted from defense to offense. Brenda's fatal error wasn't just in creating a fraudulent document, but in giving it to a lawyer. She had handed me the very weapon I needed to not just win, but to utterly dismantle her position. However, I knew that simply pointing out the forgery might not be enough. He said, she said over a document could get bogged down. I needed more. I needed to understand the system that allowed a person like Brenda to flourish. I needed to look inside the black box of the Crestwood Meadows HOA, and the law provided me with the tools to do just that. My first move was to formally request, under the state's Common Interest Community Act, a complete set of the HOA's records. The act grants any homeowner the right to inspect the association's books, meeting minutes, contracts, and financial statements. Of course, I wasn't technically a homeowner, but Brenda and her lawyer had just sent me a letter, accompanied by a forgery, insisting that I was. It was a beautiful catch-22 of her own making. By their own logic, I had every right to see the records. I drafted a formal request, citing the specific statutes, and sent it to both Brenda and Mr. SNIDE. I asked for the last 5 years of financial audits, all bank statements, minutes from all board and homeowner meetings, a current roster of members, and copies of all contracts with vendors. I knew she would never comply. The refusal itself would be another piece of evidence, a violation of the very state laws she claimed to be enforcing. While I waited for the inevitable refusal, I started doing some old-fashioned groundwork. I took a walk through the actual Crestwood Meadows neighborhood. It was, on the surface, idyllic. The lawns were manicured to within an inch of their lives. The houses were all painted in a limited palette of approved beiges, and there was a general sense of oppressive tidiness. But as I walked, I started noticing things. The playground equipment in the community park was faded and had rust spots. The tennis court nets were frayed. The surface of the pool, visible through the fence, had a few tiles missing along the waterline. These were small things, but they spoke of deferred maintenance. They suggested that the money being collected in dues wasn't all going back into the community as it should. I struck up a conversation with a man who was washing his car in his driveway. I introduced myself as a new resident from the adjacent enclave. "Ah," he said, his eyes darting around nervously. "Welcome. just keep your head down." I asked him what he meant. "Brenda," he whispered, as if the name itself could summon her. "She runs this place like her own little kingdom. Fines for everything. You put your garbage can out an hour too early? $50. Your kid leaves a bike in the driveway? $75. Most of us just pay. It's easier than fighting her." He had pointed me toward the Achilles heel of every petty tyrant, a discontented populace. Later that week, I saw an older gentleman meticulously weeding his flower bed. He had an air of quiet dignity about him. I tried the same approach. "Hello, I'm Mark from over in the new section." He straightened up, a kind smile on his face. "Arthur," he said, extending a dirt-covered hand, "good to have new blood around, even if you are on the frontier." I laughed and mentioned my welcome from Brenda. Arthur's smile vanished. "Ah, yes. Our esteemed president. Let me guess. She told you that you were part of the club and owe her money." I nodded. "Happens every time someone moves into the enclave. Most people tell her to get lost and she eventually gives up. You must have really gotten under her skin." I decided to take a chance. "Arthur, I used to be on the board of a condo association years ago. I'm just curious. How is this one run? Are the finances healthy?" Arthur looked me up and down, as if taking my measure. He must have liked what he saw. "Healthy? That's a good question. One we're not allowed to ask anymore. I was on the initial board right after the developer handed it over. We were transparent. We had open meetings, published the budget. Then Brenda got elected president 5 years ago. Her husband, Gary, who is an accountant, mind you, became treasurer. The first thing she did was fire the independent management company we had and announced she would be personally managing the association to save us money. Since then, getting a straight answer about finances has been impossible. The meetings are a joke. She controls the proxies, so the elections are just a formality. We see the dues go up every year, but," he gestured toward the slightly dilapidated tennis courts, "we don't see where the money is going." This was gold. Arthur was my insider. He had the history, the context. I told him I was a lawyer and that I was looking into Brenda's claim on my property. A spark lit up in his eyes. "A lawyer, you say? Good. It's about time someone with some teeth stood up to her." He told me about a landscaping company, Pristine Lawns LLC, that had been awarded an exclusive, no-bid contract 5 years ago, right after Brenda took over. Their rates were nearly double the going market rate. He also told me about the annual community gala, a black tie event that cost the HOA nearly $50,000 a year, but was attended mostly by Brenda's personal friends. The pieces were starting to fit together. As expected, Mr. Snide's response to my request for documents arrived. It was curt and dismissive. "My client does not recognize your standing to request such sensitive financial information. Your request is denied. Please be advised that a lien will be filed against your property if your account is not settled." Perfect. They had just violated state law in writing. Then came Brenda's masterstroke, her biggest mistake. She sued me. The notice arrived via a process server. The Crestwood Meadows HOA was suing me in district court for $575 in unpaid dues and fines, plus attorney's fees. It was an act of pure hubris. She was so convinced of her own power, so certain that I would fold under pressure, that she voluntarily delivered our dispute into the one arena where I held an insurmountable advantage, a court of law. She thought she was cornering me. In reality, she had just walked into my office and handed me a signed confession. The lawsuit changed everything. It triggered the magical legal process known as discovery. Now, my requests for documents were no longer polite asks that they could ignore. They were legally binding demands, backed by the power of a judge. Failure to comply would mean sanctions, contempt of court, and could even lead to a default judgment against them. I immediately filed my answer to their complaint, denying all their claims. And with it, I filed a counterclaim for harassment, attempted fraud, and abuse of process. And then, I served them with my first set of interrogatories and requests for production of documents. It was a mirror of my earlier, informal request, but this time it had the force of law. I demanded every single financial record, every contract, every email between board members, and, most importantly, any and all documents, drafts, and correspondence related to the Third Amendment. The clock was ticking for Brenda. She could no longer hide behind bluster and a mailbox at the UPS store. She was about to find out what it felt like to be deposed by a lawyer who knew exactly where the bodies were buried. The discovery process was like turning over a large, flat rock in a damp forest. What crawled out was pale, squirming, and deeply unpleasant. Brenda and her lawyer, Mr. SUED, fought me every step of the way. They filed motions to quash my requests, claiming they were overly broad, burdensome, and designed to harass. I filed counter-motions explaining to the judge, in painstaking detail, why every single document was relevant. The judge, an experienced and no-nonsense woman named Judge Miller, saw through their tactics immediately. In a preliminary hearing, she looked over their objections and then looked at Mr. SUED over the top of her reading glasses. "Counselor," she said, her voice dry as sandpaper, "your client initiated this lawsuit over a claim of $575. The defendant has raised a credible defense questioning the very basis of your client's standing. These documents appear to go directly to that question. You will produce them. All of them. Within 30 days. It was a total victory. The 30 days passed, and a large box of documents arrived at my office. It was a disorganized mess. Thousands of pages thrown together in no particular order. A classic document dump designed to overwhelm and obfuscate. But for someone like me, who spent his professional life sifting through corporate chaos, it was a treasure chest. I spent the next 2 weekends holed up in my home office, fueled by coffee, with highlighters and sticky notes, piecing together the sordid story of the Crestwood Meadows HOA. The financials were even worse than Arthur had suspected. There were no formal audits, just profit and loss statements prepared by Brenda's husband, Gary. They were riddled with irregularities. I found the contract for Pristine Lawns LLC, the landscaper Arthur mentioned. A quick corporate search revealed the LLC was registered to Brenda's brother-in-law. The contract was for an astronomical sum and contained an automatic 10-year renewal clause. It was blatant self-dealing. Then there was the HOA Management and Administrative Services line item, a recurring monthly charge of $5,000. The payee was a company called B Management Solutions, another corporate search, another bombshell. The sole proprietor of B Management Solutions was one Brenda herself, registered under her maiden name. She was paying herself $60,000 a year from the HOA coffers to be her own manager, on top of the power she wielded as president. This wasn't just mismanagement. This was embezzlement, plain and simple. The meeting minutes told another story, a story of a slow-motion corporate coup. In the early years, the minutes were detailed, debates were recorded, votes were tallied. After Brenda's election, they became vague and useless. The board discussed landscaping and approved a new contract. A motion was made to approve the budget. It passed. There were no vote counts, no record of who was present, no mention of any dissenting opinions. Many of the pages looked like they had been retyped, with signatures that looked suspiciously uniform. According to the bylaws, major contracts required a majority vote of the entire board. Yet the 10-year massively overpriced landscaping contract was approved in a special session where only Brenda and her husband were listed as present. But the smoking gun, the ultimate piece of incontrovertible evidence, was buried deep in a folder of correspondence related to the forged amendment. I found the email chain. It was between Brenda and Mr. SUED. Brenda wrote, "We need something stronger to make this guy in the enclave pay up. He's a lawyer and is questioning my authority." SUED replied, "The plat maps are a problem. The only way to legally bring his property in would be a full vote of the membership and the consent of the property owner, which you won't get. It would be a long and expensive process." Brenda's reply made the hair on my arm stand up. "Forget that. Can't you just draft something that looks official? An amendment or something? Just backdate it." He'll never know the difference. No one ever reads this stuff anyway. Snide's response was a masterpiece of cowardly self-preservation. Brenda, I cannot and will not create a fraudulent document. That would be a serious ethical violation and illegal. However, if you were to provide me with a pre-existing, signed and notarized amendment, I could then act upon that document as a representation from my client. He was washing his hands of the crime while giving her the roadmap to commit it. He knew exactly what she was going to do. And in the very next email, Brenda had attached the Word document file for the forgery. Its file name? Oh, legal thingy draft v3, docs. She hadn't even bothered to change the file name before sending it, and Mr. Snide had never questioned it. He had taken her fraudulent document, which he had all but instructed her to create, and used it as the basis for a legal threat and then a lawsuit. He was complicit. He had, at the very least, committed willful blindness. At worst, he was an accessory to fraud. I now had everything. The clear, official evidence that I wasn't in the HOA. The forged document they were using to claim I was. And now, the email chain showing they knew it was a forgery. It was a complete, self-contained case of malicious prosecution. But I wasn't just going to use it to get my case dismissed. Brenda had victimized an entire community of 200 homeowners for years. They deserved to know where their money was going. I spent a day drafting a simple, 2-page letter. It was written in plain English, not legalese. On the first page, I laid out the simple facts. Fact: according to official county records, our HOA consists of the 200 homes in Phase 1. Fact: the OA's own bylaws require an annual independent audit of its finances. The last audit on file was 6 years ago. Fact: state law requires all contracts with a value over 50 to be approved by a majority vote of the board in an open meeting. Fact: the HOA is currently paying over $200,000 a year for a landscaping contract with a company owned by a direct relative of a board member, a contract which was never brought to a vote before the homeowners. I listed a dozen such facts, each one a bombshell. On the second page, I included a small copy of the county plat map showing the real boundaries and a breakdown of the budget, showing the massive payments to Brenda's and her brother-in-law's companies. I made no accusations of illegality. I just presented the numbers and the documents. At the bottom I wrote, a lawsuit has been filed by the HOA board against a homeowner in the enclave. As part of this lawsuit, these documents have come to light. As members of the Crestwood Meadows HOA, you have a right to know how your money is being spent and how your association is being governed. I encourage you to ask the board for a full explanation. I made 200 copies. That evening, with Arthur acting as my guide, I walked through Crestwood Meadows and placed a letter in every single mailbox. It was like sowing the seeds of a revolution. All we had to do now was wait for them to sprout. The fallout from my letter was immediate and spectacular. It was like I had dropped a lit match into a puddle of gasoline. My phone started ringing the next day. It was Arthur. "Mark, you've done it now," he said. But he was chuckling. "There's a firestorm brewing. People are out in their yards talking to each other for the first time in years. The neighborhood Facebook group has exploded. Everyone is holding your letter." Brenda, predictably, did not react well to having a spotlight thrown on her secret kingdom. Her first move was to post a frantic, all-caps message in the Facebook group. A malicious and disgruntled individual who is not even a member of our community has been spreading vicious lies and fake documents, she wrote. "This is slander, and I am consulting our lawyer. Do not believe this misinformation. He is just angry because he is being sued for not paying his dues like everyone else." It was a fatal miscalculation. The homeowners, now armed with facts and questions, weren't buying it. The replies were swift and brutal. "Brenda, is it true that Pristine Lawns is owned by your brother-in-law? Can you please post a copy of the last 5 years of financial audits as required by law? Why are we paying $60,000 a year for management services to a company that's registered to you?" Her attempts to delete the comments were futile. For every one she deleted, 5 more appeared. Her authority was crumbling in real time. Panicked, she announced an emergency homeowners meeting to be held in the community clubhouse 2 nights later. The stated purpose was to address the recent spread of defamatory information and to reaffirm the board's integrity. It was meant to be a show of force, a public shaming of her critics. Instead, it became her Waterloo. The night of the meeting, the clubhouse was packed to the gills. I had never seen so many beige-clad angry people in one room. Arthur and I stood at the back, just observing. Brenda stood at a podium at the front of the room, flanked by her husband Gary, who looked like he was about to be physically ill, and the other 2 board members, who looked like terrified hostages. Brenda began with a tirade about loyalty, community spirit, and the unprecedented attack by an outsider. She held up my letter. "These are lies," she shrieked. "Calculated lies designed to tear our community apart." A woman in the front row, someone I didn't know, stood up. "Then show us the real documents, Brenda," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Show us the audits. Show us the signed minutes from the meeting where you approved that landscaping contract." Brenda stammered, "Those are confidential board documents. We can't just—" "Yes, you can," another man shouted from the side. "The state law says we have a right to see them." The room erupted in a chorus of agreement. The mood had turned from questioning to hostile. Gary, the treasurer, was sweating profusely, his eyes darting towards the exit. Brenda tried to regain control, banging a gavel on the podium. "Order! Order! This is not how we conduct ourselves." But it was too late. The dam of fear and apathy she had so carefully constructed over 5 years had burst. Homeowners were shouting questions about the missing pool tiles, the $50,000 gala, the constant fines that seemed to vanish into a black hole. Arthur chose his moment perfectly. He stepped forward into the center of the room. He was universally respected as one of the original residents. When he spoke, the room fell silent. "Brenda," he said, his voice ringing with moral authority, "I was on the first board. We prided ourselves on transparency. We would have never approved a no-bid contract to a family member. We would have never hidden the financials. We would have never, ever operated like this. What have you done with our community? And what have you done with our money?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. Brenda stared at him, her face a mask of fury and panic. She had lost control completely. The meeting devolved into chaos, with residents demanding her immediate resignation. Her enablers on the board looked at each other, the reality of their own liability dawning on them. They were witnessing the complete collapse of their regime. I saw Mr. SUED, who had foolishly shown up, slip out a side door, his face ashen. He knew what was coming. The court date for her lawsuit against me was the following week. In a last-ditch effort, SUED called me, his tone now obsequious and desperate. "Mr. Mark," he began, "I think there has been a terrible misunderstanding all around. My client is prepared to withdraw her lawsuit against you, with prejudice. We can just make this all go away." I let him twist in the wind for a moment before I replied, "Oh no, Mr. SUED, we're not making this go away. Your client filed a frivolous lawsuit against me based on a fraudulent document. You were her willing instrument. You ignored clear evidence. You violated your ethical duties. You are not withdrawing. We are going to court. I have already filed a motion for sanctions against both you and your client. I'm going to get my case dismissed, and you are going to pay for every second of my time. I will see you on Tuesday." I hung up the phone. There would be no settlement. There would be no quiet withdrawal. Brenda wanted a public fight, and I was going to give her one. She had built her power on a foundation of public perception, intimidation, and control. I was about to demolish that foundation in the most public forum of all, a court of law, with all the facts, evidence, and legal authority I had meticulously assembled. The 3-minute clock was about to start.